Okay, here we are, our 10th session, 10th look at the attitudes of being, a thematic study of the Sermon on the Mount, based on the Beattitudes, the 8 statements of being. Sermon on the Mount is the chapters 5, 6, and 7 out of the Gospel according to Matthew, and the Beatitudes are 8 statements that begin the sermon, verses 3 through 10 of chapter 5 of Matthew. And this is, like it says in the materials, that this covers the essentials of Jesus' teachings. It's a condensation of what Jesus taught down into what we call a sermon. Now, was it actually a Sermon on the Mount? Did it actually happen as one sermon? Was it a compilation of teachings that Jesus gave? We don't know for sure. But what we had, because we in the other Gospels, we have bits and pieces of this, but not, the most complete is in the Sermon on the Plain in the Gospel according to Luke. But it's a little different. So Matthew was a tax collector. The disciple Matthew was a tax collector, so he must have been able to read and write to keep track of who he was receiving taxes from and who he paid it out to, etc. And so he was most likely called for that purpose, to take notes, if you will. Described, exactly. And so these 8 attitudes of being, they call it Beatitudes because the first word in the Latin is beati, which literally means blessed. It's interpreted most often as blessed. It could also mean happy or fulfilled. And so some people call these the be happy attitudes, or the fulfillment attitudes, or the fulfillment elements of fulfillment consciousness. And these 8 statements also parallel the Buddha's 8-fold path and the 8 limbs of Raja Yoga. And so we've been looking at those paths, those 8 paths and the 8 limbs as well as we go along. And we had an introduction on being, talking about the Beatitudes and what that all meant, a little more in depth than we just did. Second session, we looked at the first Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, and realizing that talks about being open, that it's being free from poor in spiritual pride. He was talking to people who were the chosen people, and they felt they were above everybody else. And then being free, the second one was being free. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. So when we release and let go of those preconceived notions, when we release and let go of our attitudes of self-worth, whether we think we're better than or worse than, that's still the ego kicking in. There's a certain mourning that goes in, and there's a releasing, if you will. Releasing is clarifying our consciousness. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Meek is being non-resistant. It's similar to being poor in spirit, but poor in spirit has to do with our relationship with people, whereas being meek has to do with our relationship with God, that we are meek to God, that there is a God and I'm not it. And that when I let God be God, things are much better in my life.
Matthew, going
Yes.
back to blessed are they that mourn.
Blessed are they that mourn.
It's often used at funerals.
At funerals, right?
In some communities. Because that's the time when, as you release your grief, you can be comforted. You can put things back in order.
Exactly. So it also is used at funerals, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we recognize mourning on an outer sense.
Mm-hmm.
That display of, and when we're talking about Unity's perspective, to a great extent, we're looking at the consciousness level, what's going on in our thinking and feeling at the mental level, and how that relates to these spiritual principles.
Right, because I hear a lot of people, as they move through their mourning process,
through the grief process, you're right.
Use that phrase, and this part troubles me too. I lost my mother.
Right.
I lost my child.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, there's nothing really lost.
Nothing's lost in
So I
God.
think when we're going through this grieving process, it helps us to realize that we are releasing them
Mm-hmm.
as they have released us.
Mm-hmm. That nothing ever
That's
really
nothing lost in
dies.
spirit.
That's the beauty of a unity memorial service, I believe, is that we talk about eternal life. We don't that death is just a door that we walk through, that we all continue to live. And so mourning has its place. Grieving has its place because we have to release and let go of what was in order to accept and participate in what is and what will be. So the fourth beatitude, being positive, hunger and thirsting for righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they shall be fulfilled. So hunger and thirsting has to be, that's really, hunger and thirst are two basic elements. We have to eat and we have to drink. So there's using that simile, if you will, or that metaphor for righteousness or the right use of our consciousness. Mm-hmm. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about how we show up to life, how we show up in different situations. So hungering and thirsting for righteousness is about how we touch everything with an open, receptive attitude, releasing and letting go of preconceived notions, knowing that God is in charge. And that's the right use of our consciousness. And then we went into the life of prayer, a couple of sessions on the Lord's Prayer, understanding the Lord's Prayer as a model for affirmative prayer. Emmett Fox calls it an invocatory prayer. We're invoking a consciousness of God. Eric Butterworth talks about how we don't pray to God, that effective prayer is not praying to God, but praying in God, which is basically the same thing. So we're affirming the presence of God. We could change a few words and realize that we're not begging God for daily bread. We're affirming that God is giving us our daily bread, etc., etc. And then we went on to blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And this is the only beatitude where what is given is received. So the consciousness of mercy is both given and received. So it's Emmett Fox and Eric Butterworth, they call it the law of consciousness, the law of life, that as we give, so shall we receive, that this is the basic law of life. And in unity, we recognize it as the law. The ultimate law is giving and receiving. We talk about the law of mind action, thoughts held in mind, produce after their kind. We can talk about the law of acceptance, that what we accept into consciousness eventually works out into our lives. We can talk about the law of attraction, that like attracts like. That's the more popular version of it these days, the law of attraction. And it's used mostly in the terms of attracting stuff to us, right? We visualize, we treasure map, we affirm, and it usually has to do with bringing stuff into our lives or being successful in some way. And really, it's an understanding of how the law works, that we attract into our lives that which we focus on, right? That like attracts like. That the thoughts held in mind produce after the kind. And emphasis on held. Just passing thoughts are not necessarily going to create havoc or abundance in our lives, but those that we focus upon. So this is the law of consciousness, law of mind action. And then last time we talked about being faith-filled. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall be... My mind just went blank on there. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Right, for they shall see God. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So in order to see God, we have to purify our hearts. What are our hearts? Well, our hearts, in this sense, are our thoughts and our feelings, that where we spend most of our time and where we come from. It's where we abide, if you will. A heart center. It's like John says that God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. So we abide in love. The heart center is the love center. So when we, blessed are the pure in heart, and we purify by eliminating all the dross, eliminating all the impurities, by filtering out of consciousness all those negative thoughts and feelings and attitudes. in order to just know God. You know, it's if we don't see God in all, we don't see God at all. I love to use that quote from my teacher, Yogi Bhajan. If you don't see God in all, you don't see God at all. So in order to, when we start looking for God and seeing God, then we know that we have purified our hearts. That there is not a spot where God is not. It's not a good English, but it's good unity thinking. There's not a spot where God is not. That wherever we are, God is. Yes, Mary.
You know, it just is kind of coming together for me that even before there was this emphasis on the law of attraction, which you covered in the previous Beatitudes.
Sure. Law of attraction.
Yeah, Unity was teaching it in a more subtle way.
Right.
I remember sitting in my home church, Westside Unity in Detroit, with Reverend Ruth Mosley.
Right.
And the dawning hit me of, if thoughts held in mind produce after their kind, and they do, and thoughts are things, and they are.
Thoughts held in mind and thoughts are things, right?
Then I'm the turkey that did this. Whatever
exactly.
Situation I'm in. And that's, to me, the basis of the law of attraction.
That's the beginning of awakening, becoming aware that we have created our own lives. Mm-hmm. And, you know, most of us get into a certain level of metaphysical guilt over that and say, oh, I really screwed it up, but that's an opportunity. Once we realize that we have an effect, that our life today is the result of the thoughts and the feelings that I held yesterday, and tomorrow will be the result of the thoughts and the feelings I hold today. And so I can choose my thoughts and feelings today. That my actions, my thoughts, my feelings will produce my experience of tomorrow. That doesn't mean I'm going to make things happen per se, but I am going to have an influence on them, and whatever occurs, I will know that it's in divine order and divine timing. When we recognize it's all in divine order and divine timing, and as we change our consciousness, as we change the thoughts that we choose to hang on to, that we think on a regular basis, and the feelings that we choose to hang on to. That doesn't mean we don't have negative feelings. It doesn't mean we don't have negative thoughts, but which ones do we choose to hang on to? And we have the negative feelings and the negative thoughts. We use them as signposts. We use them as guides to direction that we are to head in order to move beyond the need for those negative thoughts and negative feelings. So today we're on to blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. So we are all children of God, correct? Would you buy that? Right? I believe in unity we should recognize that we are all children of God. And Emmett Fox, in his book Sermon on the Mount, says, here we receive an invaluable practical lesson in the art of prayer. And prayer, be it remembered, is our only means of returning to our communion with God. To our communion with God. So what we're talking about here is being conscious of our communion with God. And to me, that's what prayer is. Conscious communion with God. He says to the casual reader, this beatitude might sound like a mere conventional religious generalization, even a sententious platitude of the kind too often favored by people who are anxious to be edifying without having anything in particular to say. Right. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. And we throw these things out, and quite often I hear preachers preaching, and they throw these things out, and I wonder sometimes if they even know what it is they're saying. He says, as a matter of fact, prayer is the only real action in the full sense of the word, because prayer is the only thing that changes one's character. That's what we're talking about, changing one's character. The character is a result of our consciousness. In Unity, we often talk about consciousness. Here he's using the word character. And the character is a reflection of our consciousness. If we have a positive consciousness, a growing consciousness, a creative consciousness, then that's our character. That's what we present to the world. And then later on, I'd love to just read the whole book to you. But anyway, the great essential for success in prayer is that we first attain some degree of true peace of mind. And that's the quote that's in the materials this morning. The greatest essential for success in prayer is that we first attain some degree of true peace of mind. And there's a whole paragraph kind of in between this, with one of those lines in between that breaks the little bit and shows that this is kind of explaining it, right? So the great essential for success in prayer, for obtaining that sense of the presence of God, which is the secret of healing oneself and others too, of attaining inspiration, which is the breath of the soul, of acquiring spiritual development, is that we first attain some degree of true peace of mind. I shortened it down to just that little bit that's on the outside of the double lines. Great sense is that we first attain some degree of peace of mind. So we're talking about, remember, Jesus was a spiritual teacher. He was not teaching revolution. He was not teaching people how to bake bread or to build furniture. Right? He was not telling people, what right and wrong, because we all have an essential idea of what is right and wrong. But he was talking about at a level of consciousness. And we often look at the Bible as history. We look at the Bible as mystery, and we also look at the Bible as our story. Right? It's the story of our soul unfoldment, evolvement, etc. And here we're looking at a soul level. We're taking it beyond the written word, the literal word, to the soul level. That Jesus was teaching at so many different levels. It says he taught, what's the word I'm looking for? He taught in parables, and without a parable did he not teach. So everything that he says is a parable. And a parable are earthly stories with heavenly meanings. In other words, he's using physical description in order to talk about an evolution of consciousness. And so here we're talking about peacemakers, they shall be sons of God. Well, to be a son of God, that means that we are coming from God, that God is our source, God, that we understand God, that we realize that God is our source, and that we are expressing spirituality. Not religion, but spirituality. Talking about our conscious relationship with God, that there is a God, we're not it, and that we are parts and parcel of God, that we are expressions of God, that we are children of God. And one of the first things we have to do is to affirm that we are children of God. In the Discover the Power Within You, Eric Butterworth, longtime Unity minister, built the Detroit Unity Temple before he moved out to New York City. He talks about this as an important key to the potential God power in man. Man is a spiritual being, a true child of God in spirit, but he only becomes this in fact an expression when he is attuned to the infinite and expresses his God-given potential of love and peace. This calls for much meditation, scientific prayer, the diligent conditioning of the mind to the accepting and releasement of the dynamic God potential within. This is an all-important key to potential of God, that we are spiritual beings, that we are children of God, but mentally and emotionally we don't act like it. We don't believe it. We don't, we think we are somehow separate from God, and this is the beginning point for error. And as we get into the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, we'll be talking about this error consciousness a little bit more. He says the first step is that we must call ourselves sons of God or children of God. He's using the old version, that King James version, that says sons of God, but we now in the more modern versions say children of God. This is the first action self. Call yourself a child of God. Affirm for yourself that you are divine and potential. Declare for yourself, I am a spiritual being with the potential for peace and harmony and overcoming within me at all times. I am a radiating center of divine light, life, and wisdom. I am a radiating center, divine light, life, and wisdom. Let's affirm that together. I am a radiating center of divine light, life, and wisdom. And a second time, like you mean it. I am a radiating center of divine light, life, and wisdom. And a third time, soft and with deep meaning. I am a radiating center of divine light, life, and wisdom. that we have to call ourselves a child of God and believe it, and you will be a true peacemaker. So it's about recognizing that we are children of God and that we have to have that potential for peace within each one. We have to have that peace within us when we know that we are children of God, that we are expressions of God, that we are able to go into situations that are not peaceful. We are able to be at peace in the midst of conflict. That is the test of a true peacemaker. To realize that peace is not the absence of conflict, but it's the consciousness that we bring with us into the inherent conflicts within the natural world, within this physical human experience. There's always going to be conflict. There's always going to be differences of opinion and varying levels of emotional attachment to those different opinions. From, oh, okay, that's all right, we'll go your way, to no way, I'm going to kill you. That's pretty wide swath of opinions. Now, Neil Douglas Klotz, I really enjoy this one. Neil Douglas Klotz is an Aramaic scholar, wrote this book, Prayers of the Cosmos. It's really good stuff. Rocco Errico's another Unity minister who's also an Aramaic scholar, has some good stuff about this too. But he specifically looked at the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer, and he's looking at these Beatitudes. And one of the things he says about it is, blessed are those who plant peace each season. They shall be named the children of God. Blessed are those who plant peace each season. And he talks about this word, that he uses an Aramaic word, laude. I think that's probably not the right way to pronounce it. Refers to those who not only make or perform an action, but also are committed to it. So peacemakers, are committed to being about peace. And the word peace, shlama, here in the Aramaic, shalom, salam, salem, those are all essentially the same word, means peace. Solomon, the name Solomon, literally means peaceful. It also means health, safety, mutual agreement that saves a difficult situation, any happy assembly or stroke that unites all parties in sympathy. And he says the word for children refers to any embodiment, emanation, or active production. And he goes on to talk about how that it presents the beautiful image of digging a channel or well that allows water to flow. In this sense, as we plant peace, we become channels or fountains for hastening the fulfillment of the divine will. To think of ourselves as channels or fountains. The current Pope Francis, that's what I'm going for, St. Francis' prayer. God, make me an instrument or a channel for your peace, depending upon which interpretation you look at. Make me a channel for your peace or an instrument of your peace. That whole idea that God is working through us to become channels. So that to be a children of God is to allow God to work through us. Another interpretation is the one I put in here. Aligned with the one are those who prepare the ground for all tranquil gatherings. So it has that essence of tilling up the soil and planting the seed and preparing and watering it and weeding it and we've planted the seeds for peace and we continue to grow, allow it to grow. They shall become fountains of livingness. That fountains of livingness. And the rest of the Sermon on the Mount that talks about this specific beatitude, and it's in reverse order, which is kind of fun. The first beatitude is towards the end of chapter 7, and it works its way back. And so now we're all in chapter 5, and Matthew 5:17 through 26. It's kind of in 3 parts here, but I've kind of squished them all down into one. Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And I skipped a little bit, just getting to the punchlines, if you will. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So those go together. Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets is the Old Testament. It's the 5 books of Moses, and it's all the writings of the prophets, Isaiah and the 12 minor prophets and the other major prophets, the Psalms, and et cetera, et cetera. That I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets. We cannot abolish the law. The law, and we're not talking about human law. And if we look at the law, at the Old Testament law, we sometimes see how they've taken like the 10 Commandments, the 10 basic statements, and have interpreted them to apply to specific situations. And that's where we've started to take it from a spiritual principle into a practical application. Well, that practical application doesn't necessarily fit the times anymore. And so when we read, about, people wearing diverse cloths and how that's an abomination, clothing of mixed cloths, or about, women who present themselves into mixed situations when they're experiencing their time of the month. These are things that were, because of the time and the place and the circumstances, but no longer, don't necessarily apply to today's life. And we have to look beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. And you have heard, and he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees. When he's talking about the scribes and the Pharisees, he's talking about those who are the keepers of the letter of the law. The Pharisees were the lawyers. They argued the law from the spirit of the law. The scribes were the ones that transposed, who they had it memorized, and they could write it all out from memory. They knew the exact number of letters and, et cetera, et cetera. They knew the literal. And he's saying, unless your righteousness exceeds that, we have to go beyond the literal to the spiritual. That doesn't mean we necessarily violate the literal or the physical. In the sense, we have to look at the cultural and historical settings around much of what is said. It's like a lot of people take heed to Paul when he says, women be subject to your husbands, slaves be subject to your masters, right?
Yeah.
That was taken in a context of he was expecting the second coming any minute. So why rock the boat? And he was a Pharisee. He was a teacher of the law. And he did a lot to expand Christianity, and he sometimes got it right.
Wasn't he also half Roman?
He was Roman.
Yeah.
He was a Roman citizen, but he was a Greek and a Roman. He was from Tarsus, which is in Syria. But he was a Greek, and he was also a Roman citizen. But he was also a Jew and a Pharisee and a teacher of the Jews. He was a persecutor of Christians until he had his blinding light experience, which is, when we get into the book of Acts, we'll talk more about that. Goes on to talk about, you have heard that said to men of old, you should not kill. Whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. And here again, like in the previous one, we talked about when we talked about being pure of heart, the sermon goes on to talk about adultery, and those just thinking in your mind or holding on to ideas of lust is adultery. It's taking it from a physical outer to the mental inner, and saying that which goes on within us is more important than that which goes on outside of us. And that doesn't mean that if we have a random thought or feeling that is going to condemn us. But if we hang on to it, then it eventually will manifest out into our outer reality. And so, even if we don't kill, but we're angry. So we have to look at our anger. That doesn't mean it's not right. It's not okay to be angry. If we see something happening, a child being abused or whatever, it's a healthy emotion to get angry. But it's what we do with that anger. Do we strike out, or do we center ourselves in awareness of God's presence and do the right thing instead of doing the wrong thing for the right reason? It goes on to say, if you are offering your gift at the altar, then remember that your brother has something against you. Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Make friends quickly with your accuser. I love that little phrase, make friends quickly with your accuser. To be reconciled to your brother. right? That doesn't mean that we have to approve or, allow them to get away with stuff or whatever, but to be reconciled. In other words, let's have a little conversation, let's have an agreement, let's be reconciled with each other. Make friends quickly with your accuser. And I love that phrase, accuser. In the King James Version, it's adversary. The word in Greek is antidikos, which is one of the words that is other times is translated as devil, along with daemon and diablos, and satanas, which is most often interpreted as Satan, and basically all are talking about the same thing. So that Satan is a concept. In the Old Testament, it's a concept. It's talking about, it says the adversary, the accuser, the tempter, the tester. There's many different ways in which that word Satanas is interpreted in the Old Testament, besides using the word Satan. And it means that level of consciousness that is testing us or tempting us to believe that there's something other than God. The temptations of Jesus when Satan came to him. Well, there was that consciousness that, he knew he could create, he had these powers, he had this ability, he knew how to make things happen. Now, in today's world, we would talk about mind dynamics and how we can control, how to make friends and influence enemies, all that sort of thing. That's the kind of power that Jesus had that we know of. Were there other things we've been told about? Is that part of the myth that was built up around him? There's a lot of different ways of understanding, but we definitely know that he had this power to win friends and influence enemies. And he said, "Get behind me, Satan." And he said that more, to Peter in the 16th chapter of Matthew, where he calls Peter the rock upon which I will build my church, and he says, "I will have to leave you in 3 days." In the next paragraph, and Matthew says, "No, don't leave us." And he says, "Get behind me, Satan." He's looking at Peter and calling Peter, in one paragraph, the rock upon which I will build my church. In the next paragraph, he's calling him Satan. Well, because Peter's consciousness had demonstrated that adversary. It had demonstrated the accuser. It had demonstrated that which is tempting us to believe that we should do something other than we know what is right. Right? To hunger and thirst for righteousness, to do what we know is right. The right thing for us to do, the right use of our consciousness showing up. In the Sermon on the Mount, the book by Emmett Fox, Jesus came to carry the human race forward to the next great step. We have not come merely to conform outwardly to outer rules, but to change the inner man too. To change the inner man as well. There's so much good stuff. I'd love to just sit here and read this book for a couple of hours, but it says the proper thing to do according to Jesus is immediately as we become aware of the bad news to turn to God, his real support, to refuse to accept the suggestion of trouble as binding him, and literally to drive the thought of loss and danger right out of our consciousness. That this is the outworking steadily towards peace of mind or serenity, if you will. There's so much good stuff in here. Agree with thine adversary quickly, immediately turn it out, repudiate it, refuse to accept it, and by quietly affirming the truth, give it no chance to dig in. So agree with our adversary. That doesn't mean to agree with it in the sense of, oh, you're right and I'm wrong, but to agree with it in the sense of reconciling, if you will, of bringing it to a point of truth. Right? So when one of my teachers, Verl Minto, used to teach about if we find ourselves saying something negative that we then say clear, and return it to a positive. So if we were to say sickness, we say clear, health. So we're doubling it. We're reconciling. We're agreeing with the truth, agreeing it to the truth that negative is not the truth of me. The positive is the truth of me, and we double it in order to sink it into consciousness. We've been talking, we're going to cover quickly the 8 limbs of Raja Yoga, and this is the 7th limb, which is dhyana. I think that's how that's pronounced. Meditation. It is an unbroken flow of thought toward the object of concentration. It goes on to say, in the practice of meditation, a succession of identical waves are raised in the mind, and this is done so quickly that no one wave is allowed to subside before another rises to take its place. The effect is therefore one of perfect continuity. So we're to be peacemakers, we have to achieve peace of mind within ourselves and to recognize that we are children of God. And so that to totally enter into that consciousness, we are no longer taking up other thoughts and allowing them to have a place, but we are concentrating or meditating upon the truth of our being as children of God. And so, this it parallels very well. It's not the same. Obviously, it's not exactly the same. It comes out of a couple of different faith traditions, but it parallels quite well when we look at these 8 limbs of yoga. Especially the Eightfold Path, not quite so direct, but it's definitely similar enough to look at. And when we look at the 7th of the Eightfold Path is right mindfulness. Right mindfulness. And in order to directly experience the truth, there must be mindfulness of the reality which appears at the present moment. What is real? The reality that presents at the present moment. Now there's the appearances. And we will often hang out with the appearances, don't we? We have the appearances of lack and limitation, the appearances of sickness and dishealth, the appearances of poverty, the appearances of conflict and war. I mean, this is the truth is God. God is the only unchanging, unfailing, infinite, eternal truth. And we're focusing in on the appearances. And so right mindfulness is to be mindful of the reality, to be mindful of what they call kusala sita, which is a healthy consciousness, to have a healthy consciousness. It's having a consciousness of God as our source and supply. In order to directly experience the truth, there must be mindfulness of the reality which appears at the present moment. So the reality of God, of good, is appearing in the present moment. So to look beyond the appearance to see the reality of God, to be mindful of God, that's mindfulness. So with that, next time we'll be talking about the being regenerated, or blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Let me see, where is it? Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.